Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Tali Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn. And Tali, I am looking forward to this Intimate Judaism Q&A. I want to thank everybody who sent in all their questions. We're going to have a good time.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it too. We went through our emails and our Instagram texts and we compiled several of the questions. We apologize in advance if we did not get to everybody's questions.
We'll get to that in just a moment. First, remember to check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and more. Please subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, and let your friends know about this podcast so we can continue to get the word out. I mentioned on our Facebook page, Tali, that Intimate Judaism's 4 biggest months in terms of ratings were October, November, and December 2021, and January 2022. Our 4 biggest months were the past 4 months. So thank you to everybody. We continue to grow. Thanks to you, and please help us to keep going by sharing. Please join the Intimate Judaism team on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus episodes, merch, and more. You can find the link in the description of this podcast and in the show notes. Please write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com and visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and talirosenbaum.com. Let's jump right in, Tali.
Okay, so here's the first question. I listened to your podcast about being gay in the Orthodox community, but this didn't address same-sex relationships for girls. I'd love to hear more on that topic, how it applies halachically, and more specifically, something that is difficult for me is how to deal with the conflict of finding happiness in a same-sex relationship while having a goal/dream of getting married to a man and having children.
Okay, that's a tough question. I'll handle the first part about the halachic issues involved, and then I'll hand it to you, Tali, to talk about the second half of her question. Obviously, this question requires a lot of empathy. When it comes to the halachic issue, I'm simply going to present it as it appears in the sources. The issue of female homosexual sex is not a Torah prohibition according to many authorities. However, according to almost all authorities, it is at least a rabbinic prohibition. It appears in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Samach Amud Aleph, 65a, as well as in Yevamot, Ayin Vav Amud Aleph, 76a, in the name of Rav Huna. In his statement, Rav Huna does utilize an unusual verb, which has led to some ambiguity. However, most authorities understand it as referring to lesbian sex. I should point out the Rivan, one of the Bali Tosfot, does not. He says it means something else. The Rambam rules in Hilchot Isuri Bia that that's what it's referring to, that this is a prohibition, and he implies that it's a Torah prohibition based on the pasuk that says you should not do like the actions of the Egyptians. And he says this is under that rubric. Others say it's only a rabbinic prohibition, and it also appears in the Shulchan Aruch in Even HaEzer in Siman Kaf Sif Bet saying that this is a prohibition. I know that people often assume that while male homosexual sex is explicitly prohibited in the Torah, female homosexual sex is not, and therefore it is assumed to be permitted. However, the sources say otherwise. They say that it is at least a rabbinic prohibition.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of comment on what I'm learning from the question and also what I have learned from women who are in same-sex relationships with other women. It's very interesting. One thing that I have learned, Scott, is that when we had an LGBT episode, we took on a lot. LGBT is lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans. We also had a representative who was gay, but he was a male. And one thing that I learned is that this does not necessarily represent the experience of queer women. So what I want to say first is that, yes, there really is a conundrum. There really is going to be a difficult conflict. Something that you're bringing up is the idea of if I feel that I'm in love with a woman, and if I feel that I want to be with a woman, there is something that I'm going to be giving up on. And that something has a lot to do with my identity as a Jew, because Judaism is about marrying a man. That's kind of the contract. But there's also something that I'd be giving up as an identity as a mother who will have become a mother through penetrative intercourse with a man. This is really a loss. And I'm not saying that this kind of loss wouldn't be present for a man necessarily as well. But I think that being able to specifically acknowledge the conflict of what happens when I choose to be with a woman, I'm also choosing not to experience something in my life, not to have children in the same way. Now, what I say to that in a therapeutic process is often that sometimes we have to mourn there are heterosexual couples who may not have children in the way that they thought that they would have children also. We can't always have everything work out so that you can do gam, vegam, vegam, like also this and this and this. So I think we need to delve into the conflict. I think that we also have to acknowledge that some queer women are together with women after they have already been married to a man, after they have already experienced intercourse, after they have already even had children. That seems to be a lot of what happens, particularly in the Orthodox community. But now what we're seeing is younger women being aware of their sexual orientation at a younger age, so they don't know that they necessarily want to go that route to begin with. And so that does present that conflict of, I'm never going to know what it feels like.
It's interesting. And I also want to point out that your point about our episode of LGBT not really being inclusive also applies to trans people, because in fact, one of our panelists really wanted to talk about trans people, and I actually nixed it. I said it's simply too big a topic to throw it in along with what we're talking about. We probably require some more episodes for that too.
Yeah, I think we definitely should be doing an episode about trans for sure.
Let's move on to the next question. My husband and I have been married for 6 years. We have 3 young children, and I am pregnant with our 4th. We are Orthodox. Our sex life, bluntly, is down the drain. I have no or little desire sexually, which I feel terrible about. My husband told me he is used to not getting sex because I am pregnant and doesn't really expect it anymore. He hasn't tried in a long time to have sex with me, and here I am feeling like I failed him. I want to feel like having sex, but it's gone and I don't know what to do. I have made myself have sex, but my husband says he wants me to enjoy it, and me not really being into it makes it so he doesn't even want to have sex. Our sex life seems dead, and I am desperate for help. I'm upset at Hashem for making women like this, having a low or no sex drive after babies. And before we had kids, we were having sex multiple times every week, and we no longer do. I really feel for this person. That is a tough question to read.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of emotion in this question. There's a lot of guilt. The first thing I would want to say is like, wow, you sound like you're really hard on yourself. You're upset with yourself for not kind of living up to your own expectations, your husband's expectations, society's expectations. You're also upset with God because, you're experiencing this conflict between being a young mother, having had 4 pregnancies in 6 years, and in a sense, the sexual role has gone from being something fun that the two of you did together to something that is another one of your caretaking roles. In addition to taking care of children, you also feel like, I need to take care of my husband. And when sex turns into a caretaking role, it becomes less desirable, not just for you, but for your partner, who appears to not be interested in mercy sex because it's not fun for him if it's not fun for you. So we need to just take a step back and normalize that, that's what happens for many women, not for all, but for many couples. And it's not just the woman who has a lower sex drive. Often men will have a lower sex drive. Having a bunch of small kids and trying to navigate and negotiate, especially it's been like really hard with the last couple of years of COVID and kids being in bedewed all the time. And it's just been a really tough period. And I think that rates of sexual intercourse, if people were measuring that, have probably gone down overall. But I mean, people on this podcast who listen have heard me say very often that sex isn't just about having sexual intercourse. There's a lot about kind of keeping the passion alive just in your relationship with each other. So there's a lot to talk about there. I could go on for a really long time. I don't know how long I have to answer each question, but when we look at why do I not have desire, there's so many things to look at. There's the biological aspects, what birth control. I think you said you're pregnant now, but whether you're pregnant or nursing or using an antidepressant or using any other kind of medications, there are a lot of biological influences, body image, exhaustion. There's also a lot of psychological components and relational. What I like to look at is not just about desire, because it's very hard to expect to have this kind of spontaneous desire. I like to look at motivation. Is the sex worth having? You said sometimes you try to do it, but your husband isn't interested in the sex that you don't like. Well, what is it about the sex? There's a big difference between not having desire, but once you do it, having sex, which is really great, and then saying, wow, that was really great, we should do it more often. But if you have sex that isn't worth having, you're not going to be motivated to do it more often. So I hope that gives you some direction and some hope that there really is a lot that you can do. It's really important to talk to each other about this. And then the last thing I just want to say is I'm a big believer in erotic empathy. And erotic empathy means that, even if you can't do it because you're just too exhausted, rather than turn it into, I'm such a bad wife, I'm really sorry that you have to deal with me being such a bad wife, which really doesn't help very much in the relationship because it's just being down on yourself. What you could say is, I really understand what it must be like for you. It must be really hard for you to want to have sex and not be able to. And I get it. I get that that's really hard for you. I think that people want to be seen. They want to be understood. They don't want to feel like a predator. They don't want to feel like they're bothering you. I think that one thing that you can say to your husband, you were saying that he doesn't try to have sex with me anymore. I think that ironically and interestingly, even women who have low desire, don't want their partners to stop starting up with them. In fact, when the partners stop, then they don't see themselves as desirable. And so I think that you can say, look, honey, I don't want you to give up on me. I want you to keep trying, because even if I say no, and I know that that's vulnerable, and I know that you're risking rejection, I'll try to let you down easy if I'm not into it. But please keep trying. That might be something that could work for you.
Okay. The only point that I have to add, along with your very, very comprehensive and good answer, Tali, is when she talks about being mad at Hashem. Now, obviously, I don't read God's mind. I can't answer the theological question of why God made us like that. The only thing I would suggest is that tefillah, prayer, is a real thing that is worth doing. I don't mean necessarily prayer that God changes your sex drive, although you can ask for that too. I more mean in terms of the relationship. The same way that Tali suggested that you speak with your spouse, the two of you have an honest conversation. From a spiritual perspective, I think that having an honest conversation with God and saying, God, I'm angry at you, I think that's not a negative. I think it's a positive. I think that God can handle it. I think he wants you to talk to him. He's reaching out to you. And for you to include that in your regular conversations with God and your tefillot, I think can only be a good thing. How that will change your relationship with God, I don't know, but it's worth deepening your relationship with God by telling him honestly how you feel about the way he made you. I think that would be what I would suggest in that spiritual sense.
Okay, next question. I have a good friend who is a 20-year-old dorm counselor at a yeshiva in Israel. He's very involved with the kids. He told me recently that in a conversation with a group of teens, he was surprised at the ignorance many of them had on the topic of what is and is not permitted sexually in marriage. They received no organized sex education and believed that Judaism doesn't encourage pleasure and that sex is only for making babies. My friend, who has read Rav Yaakov Shapiro's halachic positions, shared a thing or two from the Sefer and said the kids were surprised. Misinformation and only teaching one machmir outlook seems to be having a negative effect on teens and may be a factor that turns them away from orthodoxy, which is perceived as too uptight and a buzzkill. They want to be observant, but fear a life that is too restrictive about normal marital intimacy.
I do wonder whether this person's experience is typical. It could be that it is, but this is obviously anecdotal. It's this person's own experience that the guys he's with seem to be nervous about the restrictions of orthodoxy when it comes to marital intimacy. They don't realize what's allowed. So I don't know whether this is actually a big problem that is destroying everybody's potential of being religious because they think orthodoxy is something that it's not, or if it's something that only happens very occasionally. Nonetheless, I certainly think that when we have students in yeshiva, we have to be honest with them, and there's no reason to start pretending that Judaism is more restrictive than it actually is, and we probably should be much more open about the fact that sex is not as restrictive in Judaism as most Orthodox Jews, in my experience, are made to believe earlier in their lives. I remember talking to my good friend Yaakov Shapiro, and at one point I mentioned how important it is that his book, Halachic Positions, was published, because nowadays, and that was the term I used, nowadays, with everything that people see on television and the movies and their experiences, it's so important that people know that Judaism is less restrictive assuming that the couple is not in nida, Judaism is less restrictive than people assume, where they think that the only thing that's allowed is sex at night in the missionary position, and that's it. There are some who might say that. Yaakov Shapiro demonstrates that's much more open. There's much more that can be done than that. And I said, it's so good that he said that nowadays that's possible. And he corrected me. He goes, no, it's not so good that nowadays it's possible. The reason I wrote this is because that's the halacha. It's actually the basic halacha. And the fact that people think that it's more restrictive is just wrong. The more that we can teach honestly and accurately about what Judaism teaches, it can only be a good thing. I don't think honesty is, in these matters, ever a bad thing. I do think there is a strong aversion to talking about sex. I understand why. I hope that conversations like this will allow teachers to feel more comfortable about discussing things openly, and to help people and students understand that Judaism has a very wide range of voices. Just before the podcast, you and I were talking about some of those voices, Tali. Judaism has a wide range of voices about what is permitted and what is forbidden, and people should learn the facts rather than assuming that if you have to ask, it's forbidden.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Can you discuss kink and halacha, specifically BDSM, fetish, and role play? Tali, I'll ask you before we begin, can you actually define those, and then we can talk about it a little bit more?
Sure. First of all, what is kink? And I think that we can look at kink as anything that isn't what you would think is the standard, quote unquote, vanilla. Vanilla being this very classic male, female. You are turned on by touching each other in a very kind of traditional way with intercourse, and that works really well for many people. What is BDSM? So BDSM is kind of a play between people where there is a dynamic of bondage and submission. The way that it's supposed to take place is not that people actually randomly beat each other and get off on it. It is meant to be done under specific circumstances with rules of consent and with safe words. And people who are into it for many reasons, for the kind of catharsis that it gives them and the kind of sexual connection that it provides. The only thing is that anybody who's in BDSM, their only really hope in life is to also have a partner who's also into BDSM, because what's very difficult is when you're into it and your partner is not. And that's something that happens a lot, unfortunately, in the frum world, because, you don't talk about these things beforehand or necessarily even know these things beforehand. Whereas in secular society, couples who are both BDSM meet each other in BDSM clubs or on chats or online or whatever. So that's something to keep in mind. So a fetish is a kind of a not, regular way of getting turned on. We think of certain body parts as being arousing. So a fetish would be, let's say you find other body parts like a foot or a nose or other parts that aren't normally thought to be arousing. And it's not just body parts. It can be objects. It can be thinking about certain objects or needing to see certain objects. And they go to all directions. I mean, it can be, you like furry animals or you like different types of objects. And then people tend to create groups of other similar fetishes. There's also like diaper fetishes or sitting on my partner's lap and sucking my thumb fetishes. There are all sorts of behaviors. Then there's role play, which is when a couple decides to kind of play out different types of scenarios. It's just like being kids, but being grown up. And sometimes it's with costumes, and sometimes it's doctor and nurse, and sometimes it's going on a date, or sometimes it's all kinds of scenes that are basically fantasies that you actually play out in real life with your partner. One thing I just want to say from the point of view of the word normal or not normal, in sexology, we don't really talk that much about whether these things are normal or not. We talk about consent and harm. And so when you are in a consensual relationship and everything you're doing with your partner is consensual, then you can do whatever you want. The problem with some of these fetishes, if you have a fetish of voyeurism where you like to spy on people naked, or you have a fetish of exhibitionism where you like to take off your clothes in the park, then these are problems because you're breaking a law and you're harming others. So that's kind of the sexology ethics behind any sort of what's known as paraphilia, which are different ways to experience arousal.
As long as you mentioned it, let me ask you a question. You talked about the problems that arise when one member of a couple is into something like BDSM and the other isn't. What would you tell a couple when that happens, if they're a religious couple and therefore there was no discussion about this in advance, and they find out after they get married that one of them is very into this and really would like that and the other one has no interest whatsoever? What do they do?
Yeah, like I said, with the woman who is a lesbian and won't ever get to experience having sex with a man and getting pregnant that way, that life brings along a lot of conflicts and a lot of loss for which we need to mourn. So in some cases, there may be a mourning process of not being able to get what you want. Again, this concept of erotic empathy is really important, because what I found in these kind of couples is that the partner who's into kink or into different things, what they come in with is the partner kind of talking about, often with a lot of shame, what he or she wants. And then the other partner shaming that person for being a pervert, for being sick, for wanting them to do it. And it's because you watched all that porn and I can never keep up with those people on pornography. And, I really, really understand both points of view when they come in. It feels really hard to not know that your partner has all of these different sexual desires and needs. And I think that what's really important is that nobody should do anything that they don't want to do. Nobody should feel compelled into doing anything that they don't want to do. And sometimes it's really helpful to be really curious and to understand what it would be for your partner if. And sometimes just having that conversation where that person can feel, well, this is what it does for me. And very often the person himself isn't processed enough to even know. They feel so much shame about having this kink that they're not able to understand themselves why they are into it. And so that's really the process, is really trying to understand what it's about. Again, the approach today with most anything sexual oriented, as long as you don't hurt anybody, is not to pathologize it and not to look for what happened in your life or whether there was trauma. Well, that's not how I operate. That's not how I do therapy. I'm not pathologizing everything that comes in, but I am trying to understand how people work and why. So when I do work with people with BDSM, I do understand why becoming submissive can help heal them, because they've been submissive all their lives, but this way they can take control of their being submissive. Or I can kind of see if being dominant is necessarily a function of aggression or something else. I mean, I actually believe that these things need to be understood better, especially when there's a conflict about them. Now, if two people are both BDSM and they love doing what they're doing with each other and it's all consensual, then there's no conflict. Couples like that aren't coming to me. They're coming to me with conflict, and part of our work is to deal with that.
Okay, thank you. I think that, at least as I understand it, for the most part, halacha wouldn't frown on any of this. One halachic issue that could potentially come up is the question of non-vaginal ejaculation. We've spoken about this before on the podcast. The basic idea is that, according to numerous authorities, though not all authorities, non-vaginal ejaculation, done in the context of a couple's sexual interaction, is permitted if it's done occasionally, as opposed to being their primary form of sexual interaction. If they primarily have vaginal intercourse, but sometimes have non-vaginal intercourse, then that would be allowed according to many authorities. If the kink involves non-vaginal intercourse and is done as their main form of sexual interaction, then there probably would be a problem. Moreover, if the couple chooses to follow the more stringent authorities, which do not allow non-vaginal intercourse, then again, if it involves non-vaginal intercourse, obviously it could be a problem as well. That's obviously up to the couple and the psak that they hold by. Another technical halachic consideration that might come up, obviously if BDSM involves actually hurting somebody or hitting somebody, then that would be a halachic problem. You can't hurt somebody in halacha physically. There is another issue, which I've mentioned before, which is the idea of fantasizing about a different person, which halacha frowns upon. Halacha frowns upon people fantasizing about other men or women while they're with their spouse. So those are the issues that I see. But assuming that a couple avoids those issues, I don't see a particular halachic issue involved in this. I would again suggest two books. One of them is by Tali, I Am for My Beloved, which of course talks about sexual fantasies, and I think that certainly relates to this idea as well as Yaakov Shapiro's Halachic Positions, which we talked about in the previous question.
Yeah, I would say also just from a perspective of Judaism, just from a perspective of marriage and the meaning of sexuality for couples, and that sex can be so many things. So, we can look at, well, you shouldn't hurt and you should have vaginal intercourse and all of those things. But I think what's more important is that we want to be able to feel whole with what we do. We want to be able to feel like we're interacting with each other with integrity and with respect and with love and with consent in a mutual way. And so one thing that we need to do is heal the shame of the wiring. It's not about the way you're wired, it's about the way you interact with each other. And if you can interact with each other in a way that is completely respectful and consensual, then you can do whatever you want. Because really, these are ways of being playful in bed. And so if that's what you get off on and you're both enjoying it and it's enhancing your marriage and it's enhancing your relationship, then it can be a good thing. I think that being able to reduce shame around these, people just throw out these words, perverted, sick. I think that these are words that lack a lot of nuance and understanding about people's various different ways of enjoying sexual arousal. Okay, I'm looking for some advice and I don't know where to turn. Your recent podcast on birth control has brought up a lot of anxiety I have been trying to ignore since my husband and I have become frum. Before we even got engaged, we had a conversation about birth control. Due to a family history and some other factors, we agreed I would use the Paragard IUD until we were ready to have children. Then we would have children as they came, and when we decided to be done, my husband would get a vasectomy. Obviously, since being frum together, we have run into a snag. The Paragard IUD did not work well for me for several reasons. We decided to remove it only a year into our marriage, and 9 months later, we had our first child, Baruch Hashem. Since then, we have been blessed with a new baby every 15 months. We feel very blessed to experience such ease in the fertility department. Our house is filling to the max and our car is overflowing. And I find myself thinking more and more about birth control. I'm still quite young and from a family of women who have had babies later in life. So waiting things out until menopause does not seem viable. Rabbi Scott made it quite clear, as well as all the things that I have read, that a vasectomy is halachically off the table. This is not a pill I have been swallowing easily. I have so many grievances on the topic, from the simple fact that it is the safest and most practical method for us to our original agreement. It pains me that I'm considering to risk my health, which seems against halacha, to follow halacha that I feel was ruled unjustly. I would greatly appreciate it if you could shed light on the reason why a vasectomy is prohibited.
Okay, well, I feel bad. I wish that I could say that, well, there's a multitude of opinions about this. It depends whom you ask, but I don't think anybody disagrees about this. It is a pasuk in Devarim, Perek Kaf Gimel, pasuk Bet, 23:2. It says, Lo yavo psua daka uchut shavcha b'kal Hashem. Someone with crushed testicles or a cut-off penis cannot join the congregation of Hashem. It means a person can't get married if he has that. And if you look in the poskim, it appears, for example, in the Rambam, Hilchot Yisrei Bia, Tezayin Halacha Gimel, 16:3, that this includes any sort of procedure which limits the ability of the sperm to come into the penis. So because of this, as far as I know, it is universally understood as prohibited. It is a Gzerat HaKatuv, it's in the Torah, and it's not a ruling of the rabbis. This is something which is a doraita, a Torah prohibition. In fact, there's actually another pasuk in Vayikra, Perek Kaf Bet, pasuk Kaf Daled, 22, verse 24, which also prohibits the sterilization of a man on a Torah level. What the reason that God gave that is, I don't know. Some would argue, I think, that Judaism generally frowns upon any sort of physical altering of a person's body, of his natural abilities, unless obviously it's for a health reason. If someone needs surgery, that's very, very different. But to simply cut yourself for a reason, even if it might be a good reason, but it's not a medical necessity, and I mean medical necessity, the doctor says you must do this in order to save life or limb. Absent that, Judaism generally has a very negative attitude towards physical mutilation. In addition, there are also Kabbalistic reasons, I am sure, that relate to this. Nonetheless, none of these reasons has to be compelling. The fact of the matter is that there are Gezerot HaKatuv, rules that are in the Torah for which we do not know the reason. The reason remains in the divine will, something which transcends human knowledge, and we accept it not because we understand it, but because we acknowledge and accept the divine will. Obviously, the writer has listened to our previous episode talking about different forms of birth control. It's certainly not for me to say, but I would nonetheless recommend listening to it and seeing if there are any other methodologies that would be effective, that would be acceptable medically and practically for you. But when it comes to a vasectomy, for better or for worse, there's nothing we can say. It's a Torah violation.
Scott, I have a question. Would you consider for a couple like this tubal ligation for her?
Tubal ligation, as I understand it, is a rabbinic prohibition, but it remains a prohibition. In a situation that it's necessary for a medical reason, then perhaps they can talk to a rabbi. I mean, they can certainly always talk to a halachic authority to find out if there's a way to do it. There's nothing wrong with asking, even if the answer is no. But generally, tubal ligation is also prohibited, even if it's not a Torah prohibition. So unless there's a serious medical need for tubal ligation, I believe that poskim would say that it's prohibited.
Well, the sense that I get from this woman who is in some amount of pain around the idea that she really doesn't feel in control of her ability to not be pregnant is that, she says, it pains me to risk my health, and she puts in parentheses, which seems against halacha. And she feels that to follow halacha that I feel was ruled unjustly. I mean, I would kind of look at the physical but also the mental health components here of what is needed for her in order to be able to function in a healthy and calm way in her life, and possibly consider getting a heter based on the fact that her mental health will suffer from feeling ongoing resentment about her ongoing lack of feelings of control and autonomy on her reproduction.
So as I said, there is nothing wrong with asking a halachic authority about that possibility. Given the question we have right on the table in front of us, we aren't in a position to determine whether her mental health issues are strong enough that it would allow for a heter like that. But there's nothing wrong ever with asking somebody. You never know. And perhaps that person will decide in this particular situation that there is room for tubal ligation. But it's not for me to say something like that. Generally, the answer is that is not allowed. It is a prohibition, at least a rabbinic prohibition. And should someone want to do it for reasons that go beyond just a desire not to have children because of mental health or physical health, then you need to ask an authority.
Okay.
Okay, Tali, here's the next question. Can you discuss how exhausted parents of small children can maintain a healthy, intimate life?
Right. So I think that this question is recurrent. I mean, I think we kind of spoke about a lot of this in the first question, but I think this is more of like, can you give us some tips? And I think it is important to understand that sex is not just what you do. It's not just having sex. It's kind of an energy and a passion that a couple wants to try to maintain between them. So the idea of, you have certain roles as exhausted parents, but you have other roles as, yes, also friends. We have a lot of roles with our partners, that's true. And sometimes it makes it hard to remember the erotic partnership, the flirtations. And I would say you can keep that energy alive by trying to remember that you're a couple. So you could flirt with each other. You could send, kind of erotic texts to each other throughout the day. Definitely think about what works for you in terms of scheduling time. It doesn't sound very spontaneous, but sometimes that's the only way to make things happen is to have scheduled time. Think out of the box. Doesn't have to be at night. If you guys are working from home during the day and the kids are at school, that might be an opportunity to turn off your phones and take a little break and be together. So it's really about keeping the energy alive. It's really about keeping the desire for each other. The best couples, when they're older, according to studies, what predicts a good sex life when you're older is the kind of meaning and importance that you give it, the fact that you prioritize it. It's very easy to let it go. It's really hard, like anything else. It's hard to keep it going unless you make the effort to keep it going. Sometimes it really does feel like the things that you really want to do most are the things that you don't make the time for.
A little afternoon delight?
Absolutely, or morning.
Okay.
Well, I used to have a joke with my patients about Tuesday afternoons. What happens on Tuesday afternoons in most homes?
Oh, in Israel.
In Israel. It's time for sniff. Okay. People don't know what sniff is. A lot of people. Okay. So sniff.
All the kids go to youth groups on Tuesday afternoons.
Exactly. Tuesday afternoons. I heard that from one of my patients. She said Tuesday afternoons. That's the time because that's when all the kids are either at B'nai Akiva or Ezra or Ariel and the house is empty.
Okay. Now we had a Patreon Q&A not that long ago. There are a number of questions there. We're going to take just one of those questions and include it in today's episode. Here it goes. My wife and I are essentially in a sexless marriage. We have sex perhaps once every 2 or 3 months because she is frequently depressed and has poor body image, even though I find her very attractive. This leads to her having zero sexual desire. When we do have sex, it's enjoyable for both of us, and I'm especially attentive to her needs in order to try and entice her into more frequency, although that never really works. I would never force myself on her or even ask her to do something she's uncomfortable with, physically or emotionally. I love my wife very much and have no interest in divorce. However, my needs are ultimately not being met, and while my wife knows this, she simply cannot overcome her demons. Obviously, counseling is the best option for us. But are there any other options open to me in the interim? What can I do halachically about my unmet needs? What if counseling never really works? What then? Is it divorce or no other option? I don't even want to consider that.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear this. It sounds really, really hard.
It's a really painful situation.
Yeah, it's a really painful situation. I think we have to first acknowledge that. And, I thank the listener for reaching out. It's got to be really tough to be dealing with this. There's a few things that I would want to say that I kind of pick up on in the letter. I pick up on, a real kind of sadness and lack of vitality in the marriage. There's something a little bit not alive that I'm picking up on. He's describing his wife as being depressed and as having zero sexual desire. And he also talks about his own kind of need. My needs are not being met. There's also a lot of language of nevers. She never wants to. It never really works. I would never force myself, which is
zero sexual desire.
There's zero sexual desire. So I would also, if I were working with that person, I might point out there may be some kind of black or white thinking. And the other thing is that when I look at the last few questions, what if counseling never really works? Is divorce the only option? I'm picking up also on a great deal of anxiety. It already doesn't work, and I haven't even started going to counseling. So there's resistance, there's anxiety, I don't even want to consider divorce. Look, sometimes we do consider things, even if they're difficult to consider. So a lot of this is about confronting the situation. I imagine that there's quite a bit of avoidance between these two. There isn't much of a dance anymore. I'm sure that you, the listener, have, taken a few steps back on attempting to get your wife interested. And very often the male partner, if it's the male partner with more interest and the female partner with less interest, the male partner also kind of gives up over time. I think you said it yourself. Counseling is the best option for us. And I guess I would be really curious about why not. And if you're going to say that my wife doesn't want to, then I would say go alone. It's better to, get started with something, some kind of support, some kind of understanding of what's going on. You also say that once you have sex, it is pleasurable for her. So that's kind of good to know. And I would also want to understand more about what that's like for her and what does it mean for her. So all of that, and that's part of what the counseling process is about. It's really about asking these questions and talking about what is the meaning of the sexual encounter, what's actually happening, and is your wife present or is she checking out? How do you know that she's really having pleasure? A lot of times, as you know, when you want to work hard to entice her, that in order to have sexual desire, the sex has to be worth having. You say that she feels unattractive or she feels like she has poor body image. That might be. I would want to understand more about that as well. How many kids has she had in the past few years and what sort of time does she take for herself? Is she primarily a caregiver that doesn't really even have time to take care of her own needs, her own going to exercise and eating right? So these are all things that we would want to look at. I guess the answer that I would give, at least for the questions that have to do with what I can answer, would be hang in there and please think about counseling, because I think it would be, the only thing that I could really say that I could offer before you try counseling is open this up, have conversations, ask a lot of questions, ask your wife if she's willing to just talk about it. Maybe share with her what it's like for you and be very curious about what it's like for her. And I wish that you're able to deal with this and resolve it and be able to enjoy a more fulfilling sexual life together, an intimate life together.
I think your answer really covers almost everything that he said. The one aspect which I can address, but very briefly, is what can I do halachically about my unmet needs? And once again here, this is a very, very big question. There's so much to talk about. We had other episodes to talk about outer course. I don't know if the listener has spoken to his wife about non-vaginal intercourse, about trying other things, in which case there's a lot to talk about. When it comes to masturbating by himself, if there's no other option, I'm not going to get into that now. A lot of that comes to the definition of zera levatala, doing it for no reason. That requires probably its own episode. Maybe we'll do that at some point. But really, there's a lot to be said here about what can be done about unmet needs, but we need more information in order to provide that, much as I said about the first question. I think that, there is room for outer course. Maybe that's even a method that your wife would be okay with. Who knows? There are all sorts of things that can be discussed, but I think, as Tali said, I hope you and your wife have communication. You're talking about these issues. In addition to just saying you would never force yourself on your wife, but hopefully you can discuss with her the things that are bothering you and see how she responds to that.
Yeah, and there's one thing I want to add when we talk about needs. I mean, generally speaking, I get a lot of couples that come in like this, and the talk is about, I have needs and my wife doesn't seem to have those needs and she doesn't meet my needs, and how can I get my needs met, and needs and needs and needs. And I'll tell you, there's nothing less sexy than a man who has needs. I think that the idea of kind of reframing sex not as fulfilling somebody's needs, I think that most women have a lot of other people's needs in their lives that they're busy fulfilling. But also, I'm really curious about what is the experience like for her, because more often than not, the woman is not lacking desire. She's lacking desire for sex with her husband for many different reasons. And I'm not saying that there might not be some organic or hormonal issues that can be dealt with. That for sure is a factor as well, or even personal issues of depression or anxiety. But I really, looking at the more relational picture, I find that so many women, once they open up in the therapy, what we're finding out is not that they don't want. It's that nobody's really asking them what it is that they do want. And sometimes it's really to take a more active role, and sometimes it's to do something different, and things that they just didn't really think that they could get. And when they find out that there actually is space for whatever type of sex that they would want to have, like very often the husband is shocked and surprised to find out that in fact his wife is quite a sexual being, but she just hasn't been bringing that vitality to him.
So you're saying that communication actually is a good idea? Is that what we're talking about?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, sometimes it's not the communication, it's the right way to communicate.
Interesting. You want to read the next question?
Yes. Okay. I've really learned so much from your podcast. Thank you so much for putting it out there. Since I grew up pretty sheltered and also pretty spazzy, it's funny. I know that there's a lot more knowledge I'm still missing, and I had a bit of a random question I was wondering about. If you're able to answer, direct me somewhere. I've heard that for someone who has had intercourse before marriage, wouldn't be in nida on their wedding night after they consummate. If I've been using dilators for vaginismus and bled the first week I used them, presumably from breaking the hymen, and after that I never bleed, could there be an exemption for someone like me for the period of nida after the first time having intercourse after marriage? Very good question, and one that I used to receive a lot when I was a physical therapist way back when.
Yeah, this is a good question. It's predicated on, I'll give the background, which is that the first night that a couple has sexual intercourse, when the hymen is taut or stretched and it bleeds, that makes a woman, the wife, go into nida, even though it's not technically uterine bleeding. Generally, nida is only bleeding from the uterus, from the womb. However, there is an exception when it refers to hymenal bleeding. That is considered also nida blood, not on a Torah level, but on a rabbinic level. And the reason is because we wonder if in the process of having intercourse and she bled, there might also be some bleeding from the uterus as well. It's not that hymenal bleeding on its own is actually nida blood. It's not, but we don't know if there was also perhaps some nida blood. I think the assumption is that the process of having intercourse could well lead to perhaps, I don't know medically how this is understood, but the process of intercourse could lead to also uterine bleeding. So that's why we're afraid that it's combined together. So the question is, if a woman has already had sexual intercourse, vaginal intercourse, and therefore already has a stretched hymen and presumably does not bleed the first time she and her husband have intercourse, do they go into nida? The answer is no, they do not. That is clear. Truth of the matter is, I'll also point out, because it's relevant to this question, people often don't know this, but even that first intercourse that a couple has is when the woman is a virgin, even if she does not see blood, if there was full penetration or internal ejaculation, most authorities say she still goes into nida. So The fact of the matter is that even if she doesn't see blood, she has to assume that she bled anyway. This is a much more complicated question that involves many different factors. Hopefully, when a person gets married, when a couple gets married, their Chatan and Kala teachers teach them about these details. But for a couple that is having sex for the first time, if there is no bleeding and there is no full penetration and there is no internal ejaculation, if all three of those elements are missing, in that case, she does not go into nida. If only two of those elements are missing, but one of them is there, if she sees blood or there is full penetration or there is internal ejaculation, then presumably she would go into nida regardless. What if she is not a virgin? If she's not a virgin, then she's not going to nida. We're not worried about the hymen stretching.
Define what you mean by virgin. What you mean is she's had sex with a man.
It means that she's had sex with a man before. Yes, she's had penetrative sexual intercourse.
Right.
Now, if she had a medical procedure to tear her hymen, this is actually a matter of dispute. Rav Moshe Feinstein rules in Igrot Moshe that if she had a medical procedure, interestingly, then afterwards, she is assuming she doesn't see blood. Afterwards, when she has penetrative sex, she does not go into nida. She can assume the hymen has already been torn. And even the process of cutting the hymen, when the doctor cuts it, that itself also doesn't make her go into nida, even though there is blood there, because unlike during intercourse, there's no assumption that that cutting of the hymen might lead also for her to get her period. So because of that, he says that if she had a medical procedure to cut her hymen, that doesn't make her a nida, and intercourse afterwards, if there's no blood, also doesn't make her a nida. Now, the term in the Gemara for someone whose hymen has been torn or stretched is a mukat eitz. That literally means somebody hit by a piece of wood, meaning a piece of wood somehow damaged the hymen in such a way that when she's going to have that first penetrative intercourse, she is not going to see blood. In a situation like that, presumably the same rule would apply. Namely, if her hymen is not intact, if it has already been torn or stretched, then she's not going to see blood during that first intercourse, and she would not go into nida. The one question which I have, and I don't know the answer to this, is how somebody knows. Like in our questioner situation, she's assuming that her hymen has been stretched already, and therefore she is not going to see blood. I don't know if a person is allowed to simply assume that. I do know that some poskim say that a woman in this situation should ask a physician whether her hymen has been torn. And by the way, Tali, I keep using this term torn, stretched. What is the proper terminology here? I don't really know.
It can be torn. It can be stretched. There are many myths about the hymen. I even have a blog article that I wrote. The idea that virginity even is determined by the presence or absence of the hymen, that's a very old-fashioned concept. We talk about virginity in a different way. The whole idea of virginity is somewhat of a construct. The whole idea, I mean, we can talk about whether a woman has been with a man before and has had penetrative intercourse as opposed to a woman who has not, and that is certainly a recognized status. Certainly it has status halachically. But what we understand is that there's a lot of misunderstandings about the hymen in terms of anatomically what it is or isn't. In fact, just recently, the Academia Lelashon HaIvrit, the Israeli academy that creates words, changed the labeling of the hymen, which was known as the Krum Betulim, to Sha'ar Hanartik. So literally, Krum Betulin means the virgin membrane, and that was felt to have too many judgmental connotations, and that it's not really a membrane. It's not something that covers the entrance to the vagina. So it's not actually a correct term. And they changed it. There's a video that's been going viral with a doctor who speaks about the whole journey of having it changed. So when a woman works with vaginal dilators, she is generally slowly stretching the hymen, which is very different in every woman. It's just a piece of tissue which surrounds the entrance to the vagina. Some women, it's very flexible. Some women, it's tougher because it's made of fibrous tissue. Some women's hymen never breaks, never bleeds. It just gently stretches. It isn't an anatomic tissue that people generally get to see. So when you say a woman knows or doesn't know, or maybe a rabbi should check,
excuse me?
Maybe a doctor should check. I said that because there are trained women who are bodkot, and so all these women are sent to these bodkot to see if it was torn or not torn, and it's very invasive and often very traumatic. So I think that there does have to be a movement towards women knowing their own bodies, and if they feel like they've had intercourse, let's trust them that they've had intercourse.
Right, but what about a case where a woman knows that she has not had intercourse, but she still suspects that her hymen has already been stretched for whatever reason? This is not a matter of trust. It's a matter of the woman not necessarily knowing her own body.
I mean, I think that if she didn't work with dilators or didn't have a makat etz, literally like didn't fall on a piece of wood or a trunk
Go
of
horseback riding, as people often use as an example.
Yeah, but it's not likely. But I think that, as you said in the first place, the whole idea of separating is based on something that really has nothing to do with the hymen tearing. It has to do with the fact that maybe we think that the blood is coming from the uterus, which, by the way, is not really a medical, physiological thing. It's actually not a thing that happens. It's just something that the rabbis thought happens.
You mean during that first intercourse? There is such thing as uteral blood.
There is such thing as uteral blood, but there is no known scientific phenomenon of women having bleeding from the uterus as a result of first intercourse. The rabbis also believed that you couldn't get pregnant from the first intercourse.
Whenever anyone learns laws of Nida, you often say, really? Is that how it works? It's a little bit surprising biologically. Our scientific understanding doesn't necessarily accord with the way that the Talmud presents things. And the only thing I can say to that, and in fact, I once had a student, I was teaching a Chatan class, and he had learned with Rav Moshe Tendler, Zatzal, who was Rav Moshe Feinstein's son-in-law, recently passed away, and he is also a biologist. He was a biology professor. And this student had learned the laws of Nida with him before learning as a Chatan. And he told me that Rav Moshe Tendler would often say, okay, I don't understand what this means, or okay, that's not how the human body works now, whatever. For me, the halachic system is its own separate system with its own set of coordinates, its own way of understanding the universe. And whether or not it always accords with how we understand the way science works is actually a separate issue and a hashkafic issue. But to me, it doesn't change the halacha per se. It doesn't mean that, well, back then the body was different than it is now. I guess that's possible, but it's probably unlikely. To me, though, if Chazal say that's how it works, that establishes a certain halachic reality. And the question about biology is an interesting question, but doesn't actually affect the halacha per se. That's how I would understand it.
Yeah, I agree with you. Although in this case, I think that the knowledge of biology does affect halacha, because understanding what cases create the hymenal bleeding and the hymenal tearing and what cases don't create that, it is important to be able to integrate the medical information with the halacha. But I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying is whatever the rabbis knew scientifically, even if we know differently today, halacha goes by what the rabbis knew scientifically then. We're not going to go changing the halacha because we know otherwise. And obviously, that's the Orthodox position.
Living as a Torah Jew often means accepting that life is lived with multiple sets of coordinates. What Rav Soloveitchik said in a comparable context is cognitive pluralism, knowing that the world can be seen in different ways through different lenses. So I can be a biologist, I can be a physicist, and I can understand the world in one particular way. And when I look at the world through the Torah, I understand it in a different way, and they can both coexist. So when we say that hymenal blood does not lead to bleeding from the uterus, it's interesting scientifically, and I don't deny science, and I can acknowledge that that's true scientifically. At the same time, I equally acknowledge that it doesn't affect the halacha.
Yeah, one other thing just about that is that I have heard of many cases of women getting married who want to use vaginal dilators so that they don't have to separate after the first intercourse.
I read about some Jewish women who historically would intentionally break their hymen before they got married, either because of the reason you just mentioned, in order to avoid going to Nida that first night, or because they thought that they couldn't get pregnant as long as their hymen wasn't torn and they wanted to get pregnant right away. That could have been the reason as well. But that's certainly not a new phenomenon. The idea of using a finger in order to digitally penetrate and break the hymen or stretch the hymen has been going on for many years. It's an idea that appears in halachic sources. Well, thank you, Tali. That was a fantastic discussion. I really enjoyed that today, and I bet our listeners enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, I learned a lot. I always learn something from you.
Oh, thank you, and I from you as well. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Intimate Judaism. Remember to join Intimate Judaism Patreon to get bonus episodes, merch, and more. Visit intimatejudaism.com. Go to jewishcoffeehouse.com and talirosenbaum.com and write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.